And every single time Iran pushes, that defensive network gets tighter, more experienced, and more coordinated. They're basically training an entire generation of regional air defenders in real time, and that's not a gift Iran is going to want to have given out once this is all said and done. Meanwhile, the economic squeeze keeps tightening from the other direction too. The naval blockade enforcement has been steadily choking off Iran's ability to move oil in or out of its own ports, with dozens of commercial vessels redirected away from Iranian waters and multiple vessels physically disabled to prevent them from completing runs into or out of the country. That's real money, real revenue, drying up week after week, and it's revenue Iran desperately needs to keep paying its own security apparatus, to keep funding proxy militias scattered across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, and to keep the lights on for a regime that's already deeply unpopular with its own population. Every dollar that doesn't make it through that blockade is a dollar that has to come from somewhere else, and there aren't a lot of somewhere else's left. And on top of the naval blockade, sanctions on Iranian oil exports have been reimposed, which just adds another layer of financial strangulation on top of an economy that was already struggling before any of this started. There's also been this strange side story running in parallel that's worth mentioning because it shows just how tangled Iran's alliances have become. There have been reports of vessels flagged and owned by Russian interests, but described by Iran as their own merchant ships, getting hit in operations far outside the immediate conflict zone. Cargo vessels caught moving weapons components between Iranian and Russian ports with their transponders deliberately switched off during approach, obviously trying to hide the movement. And when questioned about it, Iran's government response was to file a formal diplomatic complaint, claiming the vessel as their own, which honestly tells you everything you need to know about how fused these two regimes have become operationally. If Iran is willing to publicly claim a Russian-flagged, Russian-owned ship as their own asset just to have standing to complain to the Security Council, that's not a loose partnership anymore. That's basically shared infrastructure. And it raises the obvious question, if Iran and Russia are that intertwined logistically, moving weapons components back and forth to keep each other's war efforts funded, then degrading Iran's coastal and maritime capability isn't just a regional story anymore. It has ripple effects reaching all the way into a completely separate conflict thousands of miles away. Now, back to the here and now, because tonight's strikes clearly weren't just about punishing Iran for the failed missile attack 2 nights ago, even though that was the immediate trigger. There's a broader logic at play, and it comes down to reducing risk for every American service member currently in theater. There are more than 50,000 U.S. personnel deployed across the Middle East right now, and every single one of Iran's coastal missile batteries, every drone storage facility, every surveillance node that's still standing represents a live threat pointed at some of those people. You don't leave that stuff intact and hope for the best. You go find it, and if it's the kind of target that's actually harmful, meaningfully harmful, capable of hitting a ship or targeting a base or threatening a formation of aircraft, you take it off the board. That's not escalation for the sake of escalation. That's basic force protection, and it's the same math that's driven pretty much every wave of strikes over the past several months, going all the way back to those first rounds that hit air defense systems, command and control networks, coastal radar sites, anti-ship missile capabilities, and dozens of small boats operating in and around the strait. And look, I get that some people watching this are going to ask the obvious question. Where does this actually end? Is there an off-ramp here, or is this just going to keep grinding on indefinitely? Strike, retaliation, strike again, in an endless loop with no resolution in sight? And honestly, that's a fair question to ask, because wars of attrition like this can absolutely turn into exactly that kind of cycle if neither side is willing to change its behavior. But here's the thing worth remembering. Every single time, Iran has been given a genuine opportunity to step back. Whether that's a pause in strikes, a ceasefire window, an offer to negotiate, they've chosen escalation instead. That's not the United States refusing to let this end. That's a regime that seems structurally incapable of taking yes for an answer, because backing down publicly, admitting weakness in front of their own population and their own proxies, is possibly more dangerous for the people actually running the show in Tehran right now than continuing to absorb military losses is. That's the trap they've built for themselves, and it's a trap almost entirely of their own making. And there's a leadership vacuum question sitting underneath all of this that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Iran hasn't had clear, confirmed supreme leadership functioning normally for months now, and there's real uncertainty about who's actually calling the shots at the top of that command structure at any given moment. When you've got that kind of ambiguity at the very top of a regime, decisions like launching a ballistic missile salvo at American forces start to look less like calculated strategy and more like fragmented factions trying to prove relevance, trying to demonstrate strength to hold onto power internally, even if that means dragging the entire country into another brutal round of strikes they clearly cannot win militarily. That's a genuinely dangerous dynamic because a regime that's fracturing internally doesn't always behave rationally from an outside perspective. Sometimes the most dangerous moment in any authoritarian system isn't when it's strong and confident, it's when it's cornered and trying to figure out who's still in charge. Meanwhile, on the humanitarian side of this, reports keep surfacing of the IRGC continuing to crack down brutally on their own population. Executions of young protesters reported just in the last few days in cities like Isfahan. Continued suppression of any hint of internal resistance. And that's really the tragedy sitting underneath every single one of these strike packages. The people actually suffering the most through all of this, both from the strikes themselves and from their own government's response to any sign of unrest, are ordinary Iranian citizens who never had any say in any of these decisions. They didn't vote to fund proxy militias across 4 different countries. They didn't vote to build missile batteries pointed at the world's most important shipping lane. They didn't vote to launch a failed attack on American forces 2 nights ago. But they're the ones living next to the targets. They're the ones losing electricity when infrastructure gets hit. And they're the ones facing execution if they so much as raise their voice about any of it. If there's ever going to be a real, lasting resolution to any of this, it's going to have to come from inside that country eventually, from people who actually get a say in how it's run, not from an endless external strike campaign alone, even one as effective as what we've watched play out over these past several months. So where does this actually go from here? Honestly, at this point, it's genuinely difficult to say with certainty. And I think that unpredictability is exactly why this story deserves your attention right now instead of just scrolling past it. You've got a regime that keeps taking losing shots and refusing to change course. You've got a coalition of regional partners that keeps expanding and getting more directly involved with every passing week. You've got roughly a fifth of the remaining target list still sitting out there untouched, including some genuinely significant dual-use infrastructure that's been deliberately held back so far. And you've got an American military posture that's made it abundantly clear over and over again through actions rather than just words, that every single provocation is going to get answered, and answered decisively. If you found this breakdown useful, drop a like on it. It genuinely helps push coverage like this in front of more people who are trying to actually understand what's happening over there instead of just seeing a headline scroll by on their phone for 2 seconds. Let me know down in the comments what you think happens next, whether you think this settles into another temporary lull like we've seen before, or whether this is the wave that finally pushes toward that remaining 20% of targets getting addressed. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. Because with the pace this conflict has been moving at, there's a very real chance we're back here again within days, not weeks, covering the next wave, whatever that ends up looking like. Share this with anybody you know who's been trying to follow along with what's actually happening out there, but has been struggling to piece together why coastal defense sites specifically keep showing up in every single one of these strike statements. Now you know exactly what that phrase means, why it matters, and why it just became a whole lot less capable than it was 24 hours ago. Stay tuned, because if the pattern of the last several months holds, we won't be waiting long for the next update. It's not redundancy for the sake of headlines. It's the reality of trying to permanently degrade a network that was purpose-built to be rebuilt. And that's really the strategic thread running through this entire campaign if you zoom out and look at the last several months instead of just tonight's headline. This started as a blockade enforcement mission, keeping the strait open, protecting commercial shipping, punishing Iran every time they took a shot at a tanker or tried to mine a shipping lane. But it's evolved into something much broader now, a sustained effort to systematically dismantle Iran's entire ability to threaten that waterway, piece by piece, target set by target set. And there have been reports that U.S. commanders in the region actually recommended pausing the campaign around the strait itself because they felt like they'd hit the point of diminishing returns there, that the remaining targets weren't worth the munitions being spent on them anymore, at least temporarily. But that pause didn't last because Iran can't seem to help itself. You give them 5 nights of quiet, and instead of using that window to actually come to the table, they launch a ballistic missile salvo at American forces. And that's the pattern we keep seeing over and over with this regime. Every single time there's an opening for de-escalation, every single time there's a natural off-ramp sitting right there, they take the shot instead. It's almost like watching someone repeatedly touch a stove because they're convinced this time it won't be hot. So now we're back in an active strike cycle, and there's chatter that a meaningful percentage, something in the neighborhood of 20% of the original target list, is still sitting out there unaddressed, which tells you this isn't close to finished. The infrastructure that hasn't been hit yet includes some of the more sensitive dual-use sites, places that serve both civilian and military functions, which the administration has been more hesitant about, at least up until now. And there's speculation about whether facilities tied to Iran's crude export infrastructure, the kind of terminals that move the overwhelming majority of the oil actually leaving the country, could end up back on the list if the strikes keep escalating in response to continued Iranian aggression. That's a much bigger economic lever than just coastal missile batteries. And if that gets pulled, this moves from a regional military campaign into something that ripples through global energy markets almost overnight. Let's talk about what's actually happening on the ground right now, because it's not just abstract military infrastructure getting hit. There's real damage being reported across multiple provinces. Explosions on Keshim Island, explosions reported on Kish, in Bushehr, in Abadan, across Khuzestan, near Kazarun. Iranian officials are reporting a residential building was hit on Keshim Island, and there are reports of casualties there, a family caught in the wrong place. Now look, war is not clean, and strikes concentrated in dense coastal provinces where military infrastructure sits right next to civilian population centers are going to produce tragic outcomes sometimes. That's just the brutal math of it. But here's what I keep coming back to every single time this happens. Whose fault is that, really? Iran's leadership has spent years deliberately embedding military infrastructure, missile batteries, drone storage, command bunkers, right into the middle of civilian areas. That's not an accident. That's a doctrine. It's the same playbook you see from basically every rogue actor that operates this way. Use your own population as cover, dare the other side to strike anyway, and then scream about the casualties on state television. The second, something goes wrong. It's a cynical strategy, and it's been the IRGC's approach for decades. And every single time it plays out exactly the same way. They put a missile launcher next to an apartment building. They know it's next to an apartment building. And then when that apartment building gets hit, because the launcher was the actual target, suddenly it's a war crime, and they're filing complaints with the UN Security Council. You can't have it both ways. You don't get to use human shields and then act shocked when the shield takes damage. And Iran didn't just sit there and absorb this. They tried to answer back, launching another 5-missile salvo that got intercepted over Jordan for the second time in as many nights. And separately, a strike that hit a Chinese-owned company's building in northern Kuwait, killing a worker there, which Kuwait's own defense ministry immediately came out and condemned as, in their words, a heinous act of Iranian aggression. Think about that phrase for a second and where it's coming from. That's not Washington talking. That's Kuwait, a country that's tried very hard to stay out of the crosshairs of this entire conflict, publicly and directly blaming Iran for killing someone inside their own borders. When your own regional neighbors, countries that share a body of water with you, that have historically tried to maintain some kind of working relationship with Tehran, start using language like heinous aggression, that tells you something about how thin the goodwill has gotten across the entire Gulf. And that's really the bigger picture here, because this isn't playing out in a vacuum. Go back and look at what's been happening across the wider region over the past several weeks, and it starts to look less like isolated incidents and more like a slow-motion regional alignment against Tehran. You've got smaller Gulf air forces, countries that traditionally would never take unilateral offensive action against Iran, reportedly conducting their own direct strikes on drone and missile storage facilities inside Iranian territory. Something that would have been almost unthinkable even a year ago. And they're not doing that alone. Larger regional partners with more advanced intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability have reportedly been feeding targeting data and providing defensive air cover to support those operations. That's a coalition quietly forming in real time, and it's forming because Iran has spent the better part of this year attacking commercial shipping, harassing tankers, and now taking direct shots at foreign forces and infrastructure inside neighboring countries. You reap what you sow, and right now Iran is sowing resentment across an entire region that's supposed to be their backyard. You want another example of that resentment turning into actual capability? Look at what's been happening around the Red Sea and the western approaches, because it hasn't just been the Strait of Hormuz getting fought over. Houthi missiles and drones, armed and directed with Iranian support, have been slamming into Saudi energy infrastructure hard enough to force entire refineries offline. Hundreds of thousands of barrels of production taken completely out of the picture for weeks at a stretch after strikes on gasification complexes and tank farms. And in response, you're watching air defense crews from allied nations, and this includes crews from countries you wouldn't necessarily expect to be sitting behind Patriot batteries in the middle of Saudi Arabia, intercepting inbound ballistic missiles before they ever reach their targets. Multiple successful intercepts in a single weekend, batches of drones taken down in less than half an hour during a single engagement window. That's not luck. That's trained crews, integrated defense networks, and allied nations putting their own people directly in harm's way to protect infrastructure that keeps the wider global economy functioning. All right, let's get into it, because there's a lot to unpack tonight, and this one is big. July 30th, 2026, and the United States military just spent the last several hours absolutely dismantling a chunk of Iran's coastal defense network, and I mean that literally. Command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance sites, maritime capabilities. CENTCOM put out the statement themselves, calling it a heavy wave of strikes. And when CENTCOM uses the word heavy, that's not just some flowery adjective a press officer threw in there for effect. That's a specific classification. That tells you the scale, the tempo, the number of aircraft in the air at once. This wasn't a single flight of fighters lobbing a couple of GPS bombs at an empty warehouse to make a political point. This was a coordinated multi-domain strike package that hit dozens of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps targets in a 2-hour window. And by the time it was over, a meaningful slice of Iran's ability to threaten ships in the Strait of Hormuz had been turned into scrap metal and rubble. So let's rewind a bit and get everybody on the same page, because context matters here, and if you just showed up today, you might be wondering how we even got to this point. Every single one of them got knocked down. Everyone. Jordan's military confirmed they intercepted several of them themselves, working right alongside American systems in the same defensive envelope. So Iran fires, and Iran gets nothing for it except a very embarrassing failure rate and a very angry president. And that's when things escalate, because President Trump made it clear in front of reporters that this wasn't going to just get brushed off. He said the U.S. was going to hit them very hard because, in his words, it's their turn to hit back. And that's basically the entire doctrine in one sentence. You take a shot at American forces, you're going to get a much bigger one coming back, and it's not going to take long to arrive. And it didn't. Within about 24 hours, CENTCOM assets were in the air executing exactly that response. The strike package went after military command centers, which is basically the nervous system of any military force. You take those out, and you're not just destroying buildings, you're cutting the ability of local commanders to coordinate, to relay orders, to actually function as a cohesive fighting force instead of a bunch of disconnected units waiting for instructions that never come. Then you've got missile and drone facilities, which is where Iran builds and stores the exact hardware it's been using to threaten commercial shipping and harass U.S. forces for months now. And then, the piece everybody should be paying the most attention to tonight, coastal surveillance and defense sites, along with maritime capabilities. That's the phrase that matters. That's the Coastal Defense Network, and that's what got obliterated. Now, if you're not deep into the weeds on this stuff, you might hear Coastal Defense Network and think, okay, some radar dishes and a couple of guys with binoculars watching the water. That is not what we're talking about. Iran has spent decades building one of the most layered, most stubborn anti-access area denial systems anywhere on the planet, and the entire purpose of it is to make the Strait of Hormuz a place where US and allied warships have to think twice before they move. This is the choke point where roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply transits every single day, and Iran has built its entire regional strategy around the idea that if they can't win a conventional war against the US Navy, they can at least make that stretch of water so miserable, so saturated with threats, that the cost of operating there becomes unbearable. That's the whole game. Deny, delay, saturate, and let the economic pain do the rest of the work for you. The backbone of that system is a family of anti-ship cruise missiles that Iran has been building and proliferating for years. You've got the Noor, which is basically a reverse-engineered version of the Chinese C-802, a sea-skimming missile that flies just a few meters above the waves, so it's nearly impossible to detect until it's almost on top of you, with a range that lets mobile batteries hidden along the coastline cover nearly the entire strait. Then you've got the Gator, an upgraded, longer-legged version pushing out toward 200 to 300 kilometers, which lets Iran threaten ships well before they even get close to the strait itself. Add in the Nasser and the Kausar for shorter range, fast, precision-guided hits in the confined waters, where ships don't have a lot of room to maneuver, and then, if you want to talk about the scary end of the spectrum, systems like the Abu Mahdi and developmental platforms pushing past 1,000 kilometers of range, which start putting U.S. installations in Qatar and Bahrain into the conversation, not just ships passing through the strait. That's not a coastal defense anymore at that point. That's a regional strike capability, and that's exactly why the U.S. keeps going back after this network every single time it rebuilds. And here's the part that makes this such a nightmare to actually clean up. Iran doesn't keep this stuff sitting out in the open on fixed pads waiting to get bombed. These are mobile, truck-mounted launchers running a shoot and scoot doctrine, fire a salvo, and immediately relocate before anybody can put a bomb on your head. They tuck them into the mountains overlooking the strait, using the terrain itself as cover and as an elevated firing position. They cave them into hardened tunnels and bunkers dug into rock, and they scatter batteries across islands like Abu Musa and the Greater and Lesser Tunba Islands, which sit right in the mouth of the strait like little fortified toll booths. On top of the missile batteries, you've got the IRGC's so-called Mosquito Fleet, hundreds of small fast attack boats, each one carrying a handful of Noor or C-704 missiles, designed to swarm out from hidden coves in coordinated waves, fire everything they've got, and then scatter back into the shallows before anyone can put a return shot on them. It's the naval equivalent of Iran's entire missile doctrine everywhere else. You don't need one weapon that's better than the enemy's. You just need 40 of them coming from 40 different directions at the same time, so the enemy's defenses run out of interceptors before you run out of missiles. So when you hear coastal defense and surveillance sites got hit tonight, that's what's actually being described. Radar installations that cue the missile batteries onto targets, hardened caves that store and protect the launchers between shoot and scoot cycles, surveillance nodes that track shipping lanes and feed targeting data back to command, and the maritime capabilities themselves, which almost certainly includes small boat basins and staging areas for that swarm fleet. Take away the radar and the surveillance and the missile crews are firing blind. Take away the caves and the command nodes, and even the missiles that survive don't have anywhere safe to hide or anyone left to tell them where to shoot. This is a strike that's designed to hollow out the entire kill chain, not just blow up a few missiles sitting on a truck. Now, some of this stuff is genuinely hard to kill, and that's by design on Iran's part. Those coastal missile sites dug into the mountainsides aren't just soft targets sitting in a field somewhere. Some of them are hardened enough that the US has had to bring out serious ordnance to actually crack them open. We're talking 5,000-pound class precision penetrator bombs built specifically to punch through rock and reinforced concrete before detonating deep inside a bunker instead of just cratering the entrance and calling it a day. Because here's the thing about hitting a door on a bunker like that. If you just blow up the entrance, that's almost cosmetic damage in the long run. You knock the door off its hinges, sure, but the structure behind it, the tunnels, the storage bays, all of that can survive completely intact, and a maintenance crew with some basic equipment can clear the rubble and have that site functional again in a matter of days. That's why you see these strike packages going back to the same regions over and over, hitting Bushehr, hitting Chabahar, hitting Jask and Konarak, hitting Bandar Abbas, hitting Greater Tumb Island, again and again over the past several weeks.